Today it's time to assemble our building jig, and one thing we need are solid foundations.
In order to build a quality home, you begin by laying a sound, solid foundation. The same goes in boat building, and our foundation is the strongback. It needs to be rigid enough to resist the weight of the structure that we're going to put on top of it. And it needs to be secured to the floor so that it can resist movement as we apply forces to it through the building process. A strongback starts with two longitudinal beams that have been carefully jointed on both edges to match each other. I'm using beams made out of a product called LVL, which stands for laminated veneer lumber. This is basically like plywood beams, except they have the grain all running in one direction. These make for a really nice, strong, stable structure that doesn't move too much with environmental changes. Material like this isn't absolutely necessary for a small boat, but I had them on hand from a previous project, and so it made sense to reuse them. After jointing my beams, my first step is to lay out my station spacing, and I do that by making a tick stick from my lofting and transfer those station points to the tops of the beams. The reason I do this is because the lofting already has faired lines on it, so if I made any mistakes in spacing my stations in the lofting, at least I'm working from a proven faired shape, and so those same mistakes need to be repeated on the strongback. This might sound like I'm compounding my mistakes, but in fact it's the exact opposite. If an error was made once, it's been resolved, and so we need to make sure that we're working from that resolution. Using a tick stick ensures that we're continuing the process of using established and proven information from the lofting into the building stage. Once I've finished marking out my rails, I simply construct the ends into a box form by using some 2x4 material, and I like to use some light plywood just to help stiffen it up and prevent racking. Some other blocking is also installed along its length in a few spots, just to ensure that it maintains a consistent width. After I measure diagonals across the corners to ensure that it's square, I'll install plywood decks or solid blocking in the ends in order to keep it square. Now I'm just lowering the height of this blocking a little bit so it doesn't interfere with our centerline string.
It's time to set up my strongback, and because I've got a concrete floor here and it's really quite uneven, I build it all off these sleepers. So got a couple scraps of plywood here because there's a big hump in the floor right in this spot. Got mushroom anchors down in these holes, and I just use a couple of bolts to hold it all together. Okay, once I've got my sleepers down, I just want to try and slide my strongback into sort of the center of the shop. Try and make sure I've got enough space on either side of it to maneuver comfortably. Especially need to be able to pull the bandsaw out if necessary, and of course get all the way around the mold. So I think I'll probably be sneaking it over this way a little bit. Next I need to figure out my height. So I think I'm kind of high here right now. So I'm going to get one of my midship molds, which is going to give me my overall height, and just pop it on here and have a look. I got to find someplace, find it where it feels comfortable. Okay, this is actually feeling pretty good. I've got reasonably good access to this area up here, which will be the keel and keelson. Working down here, very little work to be done on my knees, which is great. The rest of it goes down. I think I'm at a good height actually, which is nice.
Once the general height is established, it's just a matter of blocking up the strongback so that it's nice and level both fore and aft and laterally. I do this primarily with little blocks and wedges, and I play around with it until everything seems to be exactly where I want it. Your strongback doesn't absolutely have to be leveled up longitudinally, but it does have advantages, as you'll see later on in the build. But laterally, it should be leveled up very carefully at both ends, and that's to avoid any twist in your final structure.
Okay, now we just throw this together as simply and firmly as possible. I usually just kind of let the legs find themselves square to the parts. I think that's perfectly fine. grabbing each one of these a little bit lightly while I get it all pitched together. Go like this. Give ourselves a nice, reasonable cross braces, which is also going to extend the length of our footprint here a little bit, make it a little sturdier. Kind of stretching this a hair. There we go, that is really nice and rock solid. Okay, well here we go, our foundation is poured. Now there's one last little thing, and that's the most important thing, and that is our string line. So let's make sure we get that in. Let's give yourselves a little loop. Run it up through our little slot here, down to the other end.
We cut a small slot in the ends of the strongback so that the string lies below the top surface, and we drop a screw right on center.
We want this thing good and tight, close to breaking tight. And a very important thing to note is that that string doesn't touch anything along the whole length of this strongback. It's hovering above all of my horizontal members. All these cross walls here, hovering above, and it's cut down into a little notch in the very ends. Of course, up here I'm going to be putting my stem. So what I've got is just a little piece of plywood that my stem's going to rest on, so it'll drop right down on top of that string and just sandwich it in there. Just got to make sure that this thing is dead on the middle when we put that stem on there. But other than that, it doesn't touch anything. All of our station molds, when we drop it across, are going to hover above that string, and it's just a hair below the surface, like maybe a 1/16 of an inch or so, so that we'll be able to make sure that all of those are absolutely right on the money. This is better than a laser and a whole lot cheaper. Our construction is really simple. We've basically built a box without a bottom, without a top. Down underneath here, there's not much to it. A couple 2x4s across the ends, piece of plywood to help stabilize it. And of course our legs screwed up to the inside there. You know, if your stock doesn't allow you to have two even legs, no big deal, so long as they're relatively solid. And then we have a nice cross brace to make sure that we've extended our footprint as wide as we can on these sleepers and given ourselves some torsional stability. And then we've added a couple more cross braces fore and aft towards the center station here. And that's just, of course, to prevent the whole thing from swaying back and forth. And this thing is rock solid, people, let me tell you. And we're putting a plywood deck on top of here too, which will be a nice place to rest some tools while you're working, because there's always a need to do that. I can move ahead with putting my station molds on here now.
I'm not sure how easily my hull is going to pop off my mold later on, and for that reason I'm building this in such a way that I can dismantle it from the inside. And to that end I've put the crossballs on the inboard faces of my stations, but that is the opposite side of my reference faces. To solve that problem, I'm just using this little auxiliary stick to line up those reference faces with the station lines drawn on my strongback.
Jumping. The other one first. Kidding me? Between the two, wanted to move in both directions. So, what are we going to do about that? What we're going to do about that is this. nail it in place to start with. That'll hold it. It'll confuse me later on when I can't pull this thing off easily, but that's okay. Just using finishing nails to help me line up to my line, my station lines, a little more effectively.
As I pass the midship point, my reference face changes to the opposite side of the molds, and so my crossballs are now lining up with the reference faces. That means a change of strategy in how I install them.
It's cool how fast this kind of comes together if you've got everything set up. Of course, the all-important center line. Everything gets aligned to that center line. While my strong back here is really nice and dead level, and the top is level, it's leveled out, no twist, leveled out longitudinally. There is actually a slight bow in the whole strong back structure. That's just, you know, some natural shape that's in these beams. And so if I were trying to work off those beams the whole way, measuring in from the inside, I'd end up with a boat that's a 1/4 inch out of whack. So that string line up the middle is all important. And frankly, I think a string line is about 1,000,000 times more accurate than a laser is going to be any day. Because once it's taut, it can't deflect, and it's cheap and reliable. And you should know that most lasers, except for the very most expensive ones, have a certain degree of error in them. Some of them are out by as much as like 1/8 of an inch, like 20 or 30 feet or something like that. So I think it's I think old school is often better. Not that I don't like using lasers, because they can be awfully handy in some situations. But they're not necessarily the automatic go-to for boat building that some might think that they are. I remember one time my boat building mentor, I went into his shop one day and he was setting up I can't remember if it was a canoe mold or what it was, but he had plywood stations, and then he had just a single like 1/8 inch hole through each station with a crosshair on it. So obviously he had set it up so he'd put a string right down through the middle of it all, and he'd try and juggle them all up to that string. And I thought that was a hot idea until I tried it, and then I realized it was an absolutely terrible idea. It was so hard to try and juggle it to that string without touching it in one place or another, and trying to get it through the whole works while you're setting it up. Forget it. It was just, I don't know what he was thinking. But I'm ready to acknowledge that he is a better boat builder than I in many ways, and so maybe he was on the money, maybe he wasn't. Certainly wasn't for me. Alright, I gotta get this. This is an important one. I gotta get it right. So this last one I'm putting in here is not a station that's actually even on the plans, but I created it myself because I needed something to sort of fill in this particular spot. Ooh, hold up. Something is a little off here. Something's out of whack. I don't know exactly what it is, and I'm gonna, you know what I'm gonna have to do? I've got to refer back to my lofting. So I got something, I was a little screwy with this forward little jig I have here, which is supposed to support the stem and also guide me in my planking over here, but it's not landing quite correctly, and I've got to think about why. I think I understand what I screwed up. I'm just glad that I caught it. That's the important thing. I'm in the process of fairing the jig out right here, and so that means we're using a batten, wrapping it around our station molds and making sure that they touch nice and cleanly all the way along, each one touching the same amount without any dips or hollows. Well, to do that, your stations need to be good and plumb. Of course, you design your boat on a grid, so you need to build it on a grid. And the grid, in our case, starts out with the strongback. Now, we leveled it out athwartship, but we also leveled it out longitudinally, and while we didn't absolutely have to do that, there's a good reason why we're doing that. And one of the reasons is, in order to plumb up all of these stations, we basically need to square them to the strongback. And you can use a square, of course, to do that, but there's a lot of spots where the square just doesn't touch, and it's more trouble to try and get it to touch than to find an alternative solution. So in this case, what I'm doing is I am using a spirit level to plumb them up. And that works fairly nicely, especially if you're careful about getting your bubble just so. When you plumb up your molds, you need something to secure them to keep them from moving around. So I've just got this temporary batten slapped on the side here. And while this looks kind of haphazard, they're going to come off pretty soon. Normally, I would have a false keelson that runs through all these station molds all the way along, and that would be the thing I'd secure all these to. I didn't do that in this case for a number of reasons. Mostly because I'm going to be strapping the whole boat, and that's going to take care of that job for me. However, in the interim, I do need to secure these in order to make sure my mold is fair. So all these guys are just tacked in place, and then I'll fair out the other side, and as soon as this side is fair, I'm going to start strapping it. And I'll get a few straps in down low, and I'll throw in a couple up high, and as soon as that's all strapped off, I can do the same thing to the other side. Now, one thing that's interesting to note is if you look at this particular strap on here, but it does not look fair. There's sort of a funny little flat spot in it right around here. And what I've discovered with this design is there's such an extreme amount of shape happening here that you can't just slap a batten on in any old direction and have it be fair. It's very specific as to how it flows together. That's the thing that's a little bit challenging here. If I hadn't built that model, I would right now be panicking about how unfair things are in here, and I might even be inclined to start ripping it apart and changing things, which would be a mistake. So building this model ahead of time proved to me that things can fare out. If you recall, my first attempt at strapping this model with the longitudinal planks wasn't working out back here. I had to tear some out and redo it because I was trying to run them the wrong way. Once I learned that there's a right way to do it, I got it to fare out. So I got to do the same thing over here, basically. Another good reason for model making first. So for fairing out this model, I make these little plywood jacks that hold one end of my fairing batten, because you really need two hands to do this, and the hands can't be at either end of the batten. You need one to sort of locate it on the mold, and then you need another one just to be able to sort of test your fit as you go. So having these little plywood jacks is just a really easy way to give yourself a third hand. Pop one up there, and we'll wrap the batten around. And of course, you can use a square batten for this, or you can use a rectangular one and change the attitude. So I can switch from this sort of flat orientation to working on edge. And each one of them tells me something a little different. If I got a lot of twist that I want to check, I use the flat orientation. And if I just want to make sure that it is like super fair, I'll go up on edge. Of course, if it's a slighter shape, I'll go on edge, and if it's a more extreme shape, I can go on the flat.
Okay, that's as far as we're going to take this today. Now we're going to be back next time to finish off the building jig. I want to thank all of my supporters on Patreon, especially my newest supporters, Matt Ostale, Greg Lutz, and Ian Rogers. You guys rock. Thank you very much. Ciao for now, folks. Now that's more like it.